Welcome to episode 20 of the Photography Explained podcast. In this episode, let's get technical. I'm your host Rick, and each week I will try to explain one photographic thing to you in plain English in less than 10 minutes without the irrelevant details, and hopefully with me pronouncing my sentences normally. My aim is to explain things in just enough detail to help us with our photography and no more. So in this episode, let's get technical. Photography is an artistic and technical discipline. To be successful in photography, you have to get the technical aspects correct. Composition is vital, but this needs to be complemented by technical excellence of image capture. You need to get exposure, focus, tack-sharp images every time. Now that didn't really make sense, did it? You need to get correctly exposed, correctly focused, tack-sharp images every time. I'll have to work on that one, won't I? As a professional photographer, these are absolutes. Nobody expects you to get these things wrong. In previous episodes, I've spoken a lot about composition, so now it's time to turn to the technical side of things, one thing at a time, of course, and without the irrelevant detail. What am I going to be talking about in upcoming episodes? Here's a list. I like my lists. 1. Exposure. 2. Aperture. 3. Shutter speed. 4. ISO. 5. The exposure triangle revisited. 6. Focus. 7. Depth of field. 8. Focal length. There's lots of other things I can talk about and will talk about, but we have to start somewhere. So having spent quite a lot of time on some very fundamental parts of photography, I would like to go through what are the next fundamental things. What am I going to be talking about? Well, exposure. What is exposure? I will do a full episode on each of these. I'll just give you a quick flavour of them here. Exposure is it's what the camera takes. You have various settings in the camera. When you press the shutter, you take a photo, and the exposure is basically the amount of light that the shutter has let through to the sensor. Okay, so that's exposure. Now, exposure is made up of 3 components. Now, I talked about the exposure triangle in a previous episode. I think I covered that far too early for my liking, and I shall revisit it once I've explained the 3 component parts. So exposure is made up, it's not made up, it's controlled by 3 main things. The first one is the aperture. What's the aperture? That's the opening in the camera lens. Now, regardless of what you're taking a photograph with, that is, it could be a DSLR, a mirrorless camera, an iPad, a phone, film camera even. One of the fundamentals is that when you press a button that takes a photo, there is something that is controlling the amount of light getting through the lens. Say on a DSLR, it's an aperture and you can adjust it. On an iPhone, it's probably fixed at, I think my iPhone XS is at f1.8, but I'll come on to that in another episode. Next item is shutter speed. When you're walking around with your camera in normal day-to-day life, basically, the shutter on your camera is closed until you press a button called the shutter release button, which opens the shutter. When you press the shutter release button, you open the shutter and the sensor is exposed to light. So that's what a shutter does. Not that complicated, still a very precise thing. Okay, so that's the second thing. So the time that the shutter is open dictates how much light gets through to the sensor. And that reminds me, going back to aperture, the size of the opening, as in the camera aperture, determines how much light gets through to the camera sensor. Like I say, I'll come on to these and explain them all individually, and then I'll put it all together. Next item, and the third component of the exposure triangle, is ISO. Now, I've said this a number of times, I'll say it again here. If photography was being invented in this tumultuous, I shouldn't have gone with a big word then. I knew as soon as I said it, I was going to mess it up. Let's try that again. In 2020, if you were inventing a thing called photography, you wouldn't have these things. You certainly wouldn't have ISO. What is ISO? Well, I'll tell you, but the bit you need to know here is that ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor in your camera to light, and you can change it. So you've got exposure is made up of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Once I've finished broadcasting this episode, or recording it even, I'm going to go and find some speech tuition because I'm not doing a good job here, and I've not even had a beer yet. So, aperture, shutter, ISO, these are fundamentals with so many variables, you can't explain them all together, but you can't explain them independently. So I'm going to go through each of them in as much detail as I feel will help you. And then we'll put it all together with the exposure triangle. So let's move on. What else did I mention? Focus. What is focus? Well, you focus on something when you take a photo. Where that is depends on what you want to do, what you want to achieve from the photo. But The point here is a technically correct photograph has the subject, whatever it is and wherever it is, in focus. Unless you're doing something artistic, and that's a caveat to pretty much anything in photography. There are rules and technical requirements, but you can break them if you have a reason. But you need to know how to do them first, how to achieve them correctly. Depth of field, related to aperture, related to the lens, and related to the next point, focal length. How much of a photo is sharp, or how much of a photo is not sharp, depending on what you're doing. Focal length. Again, this relates to, I should probably put sensor size back in again and go through it again because it's related to focal length. Like I say, none of these things live in isolation in photography. A lot of these things relate to other things, so like I say, you have to explain them. That's probably why it gets so complicated. You can't just talk about aperture on its own without the other things that affect the exposure. You can't talk about depth of field without talking about focal length. You can't talk about focal length without mentioning apertures. It all gets a little bit complicated. My job is to uncomplicate it and make it understandable. So those are the things I want to talk about first. These are the first technical things that I want to explain to you. We've done composition, we've explained what a camera is, and I'm not sure why I'm saying we because it's just me. So I've explained the camera, how it works in very basic terms. I've explained the exposure triangle, like I say, too quickly. And now I'm getting to the point where I'm waffling, so I am going to shut up. What's next in the Photography Explained podcast world? Episode 21. What does exposure mean in photography? I'm going to explain exposure. Then I'm going to explain aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. I'm really looking forward to breaking these things down into their single component parts and then putting the whole thing together. No idea how I'm going to do it between us, but we'll give it a go. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Bit waffly. If you did enjoy it, please leave a nice review and rating wherever you get your podcast from. And please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you could do me one small favour and tell one person you know about my podcast, I will be very grateful. Check out my website, rickmcavoyphotography.com. Find out all about me and my architectural photography and construction photography work. You can also find my blog there with lots of stuff. Nearly the last thing, but if there's a photography thing you want me to explain, just head over to my website, find a way of getting in touch. There's plenty of them. Check out the list of questions of subjects that I'm going to explain. It's on there live now, and at some point I'll get around to it. Thank you again for listening. I've been Rick McEvoy. Thank you for giving me 10 minutes of your valuable time, and I will see you on the next episode. Cheers from me, Rick.